Hello, and thank you for joining Helaman's Army today. Just another continuation on the same conversation of consecration versus communism. This one, video number 13, Marion G. Romney. And as you notice, I've got communism marked off there at the bottom, and instead have socialism put there. Now, if you recall, if you've been following this from the beginning, at the beginning of this video series, video number 3, I made a video of a talk given by J. Reuben Clark. And I made that video because that talk given by J. Reuben Clark in the 1942 was a landmark talk on the United Order and on communism. It was considered a big. This is the basics of this idea. And I decided, after going up through David O. McKay on the presidents of the church, I decided to take a sidestep and do Marion G. Romney, simply because he gave a talk in the General Conference in April 1966, which is also could be considered a landmark talk. Now, the interesting thing about this talk is that he actually gave this. Oh, I wasn't going to start there, but I am now. If you go to the BYU Speeches webpage and click on Marion G. Romney, and then go down to Socialism in the United Order, you'll get the same talk. So the interesting thing on the BYU Speeches page, text isn't very large. Let's see if we can get it a little bit bigger for us here. It says that the text for the speech is unavailable. Well, he gave the exact same speech, the exact same talk in the 1966 General Conference. So my plan today was just simply to make this small enough and visible enough that we can, if I move the wrong thing here, so that we can listen to him share this talk. I know it's hard sometimes to listen to me share a talk. So the idea is we're going to listen to Marion G. Romney read the talk to us. Now, there are a few minor differences. In this case, at BYU, he gave a little joke at the beginning of his speech, and in General Conference, he just said, "Hey, I'm giving this again." You might have heard this before. So, starting in at the beginning of his speech or his talk in General Conference, he said, "What I am going to give you now is a statement I have prepared to answer to the question, is socialism the United Order? Some of you may have already heard it." He said that meaning because I had just given this at BYU. "This is the first time I have ever attempted to give a talk a second time. My excuse is that the brethren have asked me to give this talk here tonight." So Marion G. Romney said, "Look, I've given this, I've talked about it, but the brethren want this to be shared here." So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to play his talk and we can listen to it, and I'm going to pause it and make connections with some of the stuff that has been shared previously, maybe commentary along the way. If you want to just hear President Romney, he was not president, Elder Marion G. Romney, if you want to hear him share this talk without my commentary, then there's a link to the description to his talk, Socialism and the United Order, on the BYU page. There will also be a link to the PDF file where you can find this talk if you want to study it more deeply. But this is another landmark talk, which is why I thought it was necessary to share this talk. It is just as the J. Reuben Clark talk in 1942 was a landmark talk on communism, this one is a landmark talk on socialism. And so, yeah, let's just dive right in. And I'm going to mute myself. Hopefully I'll remember to unmute when I stop to pause. We'll find out. So if you see a weird little glitch in the video as you're watching it, it's because I had to edit it. Oh, and you'll see, as we're just going to listen from the beginning, and what I read from his talk at the beginning, that is really the difference. Is he has this little paragraph. He has that paragraph right there where he's talking about why he's giving it here, and then in the BYU speech, he shares a joke at the beginning, but where he comes in and talks about the definition. United Order is a definition of the terms socialism and the United Order. So he defines socialism. So that's where the talk starts in both cases. And so that's where he begins reading his talk. So I'm going to go ahead and mute, and we'll just listen to him on BYU speeches, and we can hear what he's got to say.
I've been asked to talk this morning about socialism and the United Order. And I assure you that I approach this discussion with a great deal of trepidation. And I hope that my conclusions will be at least as sound as the researchers who had the project to determine how far and how long a flea would jump. They first trained him to jump when he heard the word, and then they pulled off a pair of his legs and said, "Jump," and he jumped. And then they repeated that cycle, and he jumped until they came to the last pair of legs. And when they pulled them off, they said, "Jump," but he didn't jump. And so they concluded that when all the legs of a flea were pulled off, he became deaf. Now, perhaps a good starting point on this subject of socialism and the United Order would be to start with the definitions.
So here's the point where the two talks start to come together.
Webster defines socialism as a political and economic theory of social organization based on collective or governmental ownership and democratic management of the essential means for the production and distribution of goods. Also a policy or practice based on this theory.
Okay, so I think this is a pretty decent definition. I'm sure if we look in any dictionary at this point, I'm sure the definition has changed, because that's what happens when you let socialists and communists change definitions. They go for it. So it's based on collective or governmental ownership and democratic management of the essential means for the production and distribution of goods. So it's not quite communism, but it's still a governmental ownership, a collective ownership. Private ownership is out. So I'd like to just point out that little tidbit of definition there.
George Bernard Shaw, the noted Fabian socialist, says that socialism, reduced to its simplest legal and practical expression, means the complete discarding of the institution of private property by transforming it into public property and the division of the resultant income equally and indiscriminately among the entire population.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is interesting is everything is divided equally and indiscriminately among the entire population. So it doesn't matter if you're a good steward or not. Here's your 10 acres or 20 acres, whatever it is. We're just going to take all the property and we're just going to give it to people. And it doesn't matter whether they're good at upkeeping it or not, because now everyone's equal. So this is the equality of dollar for dollar. Now, if you've listened to my previous videos, especially video 2, and even in video 1 is admittedly very difficult to get through because I'm just reading the Doctrine and Covenants. But the Brigham Young videos too. This is not the United Order is not equality of dollar for dollar, and that should be fairly obvious when you start to compare the examples in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I think that this is interesting, that this is just another example of here's a point where everything is indiscriminately and equally distributed among the population. So then the question comes, what happens when the population increases? Do we all just keep giving up a little bit more and more and more until we have nothing left? That's a question I've got, but I've never had a socialist be able to accurately answer it.
George Douglas Howard Cole, noted author and university reader in economics at Oxford, who treats socialism for the Encyclopedia Britannica, says that because of the shifting sense in which the word has been used, a short and comprehensive definition of socialism is impossible. We can only say, he concludes, that socialism is essentially a doctrine and a movement aiming at the collective organization of the community in the interests of the mass of the people by means of the common ownership and collective control of the means of production and exchange.
So again, just pointing out that George Douglas Howard Cole points out very specifically that the definition keeps shifting. And you'll find that the definitions shift regularly with those people who identify as socialists or communists. If you sit down and have a conversation with them and you have them define their terms, you can go have a second conversation with them a year, 2 years, 5 years later, especially 10 years down the road. You're going to see a shift in the definition because there's a reason for that. And we'll see if he gets to it in here. I've listened to this multiple times, and I believe he does get to it in here, but I'll pause and talk to it when I see it.
Socialism arose out of the economic division in society. During the 19th century, its growth was accelerated as a protest against the appalling conditions prevailing in the workshops and factories and the unchristian spirit of the spreading industrial system. The communist.
So real quick, one of my comments was to what is it that people find appealing towards communism or socialism? And I think this is a good insight right here. The appalling conditions prevailing in the workshops and factories and the unchristian spirit of the spreading of the industrial system. So if we use capitalism with the natural man, you're going to find that stuff. If it's all about just capital, 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 money, 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 you're going to find situations like this where people feel disenfranchised by the system because they can't get it under their feet. They can't get a grasp of it. They can't get a hold of it, and they themselves can't improve their lives. And so that's where you find people who are feeling oppressed or who are willing to try something different. So that's just one of the many reasons why people might be attracted to a socialist or a communist idea.
This manifesto, drafted by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels for the Communist League in 1848, is generally regarded as the starting point of modern socialism. The distinction between socialism, as represented by the various socialist and labor parties of Europe and the New World, and communism, as represented by the Russians, is one of tactics and strategy rather than of objective.
So I'm going to stop this and point this out here. So I've been reading The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, and this is 100% true. He points this out. He lays this plan out very clearly. When Engels and Marx went and joined the socialists in Germany, the socialists in Germany said, "Hey, you guys you're too extreme," because they wanted to start a revolution in order to get their socialist ideas implemented. And so really it wasn't a matter of outcome. It was a matter of how you get to that outcome. And so that's when he starts talking about that here in his talk. It's exactly what he's talking about. is that Marx and Engels were pushing for this massive, dramatic, revolutionary style change, where the socialist parties at the time were simply just pushing for changes here and there to slowly move towards a socialist system.
Communism is only socialism pursued by revolutionary means and making its revolutionary method a canon of faith. Communists, like other socialists, believe in the collective control and ownership of the vital means of production and seek to achieve, through state action, the coordinated control of the economic forces of society. They differ from other socialists in believing that this control can be secured and its use in the interests of the workers ensured only by revolutionary action, leading to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the creation of a new proletarian state as the instrument of change.
Okay, he lays it out. He lines it out very nicely here, and very clearly here that let's see, communism is indeed only socialism pursued by revolutionary means and making its revolutionary method a canon of faith. So basically, they do away with religion and they make their ideas the new religion. This is what we're calling secularism today, is the same thing as it was in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and early all the way up in through the 1930s and 1940s. And especially in through the Russian Federation or the USSR, all the way through until the USSR collapsed. That's exactly what it is that they're removing God, they're forgetting God, they're ignoring God on purpose, and they're making their ideologies a religion.
A major rift between so-called orthodox socialism and communist socialism occurred in 1875 when the German Social Democratic Party set forth its objective of winning power by taking over control of the bourgeois state rather than by overthrowing it. In effect, the German Social Democratic Party became a parliamentary party, aiming at the assumption of political power by constitutional means. In the 1880s, a small group of intellectuals set up in England the Fabian Society, which has had a major influence on the development of modern orthodox socialism. Fabianism stands for the evolutionary concept of socialism, endeavoring by progressive reforms and the nationalization of industries to turn the existing state into a welfare state.
Doesn't that sound familiar? That should sound very familiar to everybody in the United States, at least. I'm sure that if you look at other countries, and I know that if you look at like Canada, or if you look at Brazil, or if you look at Venezuela, or if you look at the United Kingdom, many, many, many other countries, that should sound extremely familiar, where basically they take the existing industries and turn them into a welfare state.
Somewhat on the order of the Social Democrats in Germany, Fabians aim at permeating the existing parties with socialistic ideas rather than by creating a definitely socialistic party. They appeal to the electorate not as revolutionaries, but as constitutional reformers seeking a peaceful transformation of the system. The difference in forms and policies of socialism occur principally in the manner in which they seek to implement their theories.
So I'm going to just pause here for just a second. He gives you three characteristics of socialism that I think are good to know and understand. He follows those up later, as you can see on the right-hand side column, with characteristics of consecration. But just wanted to point this out so that you turn on the these are the bullet point part of your brain that says these are our characteristics.
They all advocate the same things, in this respect at least. First, that private ownership of the vital means of production be abolished, and that all such property pass under some form of coordinated public control. Second, that the power of the state be used to achieve their aims. And third, they all claim that with a change in the control of industry will go a change in the motives which operate in the industrial system. Well, so much now for the definition of socialism. The United Order.
So as you can tell, he skipped a sentence there at the bottom, which should be expected when you've given a talk twice. So he says, I have given you these statements in the words of socialists and scholars, not my words, so they have had their hearing. So basically he's saying, hey, look, I didn't say this. This is what they said. I'm just repeating what they said. Okay, so now he's into the United Order, as you heard him say already.
The Lord's program for eliminating inequalities among men is based upon the underlying concept that the earth and all things therein belong to the Lord, and that men hold earthly possessions as stewards accountable to God. On January the 2nd, 1831, the Lord revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith that the church was under obligation to care for the poor. Later he said, I, the Lord, stretched out the heavens and built the earth, and all things therein are mine, and it is my purpose to provide for my saints. For all things are mine, but it must be done in mine own way. On February the 9th, 1831, the Lord revealed to the prophet what his way was, whereby he intended to take care of his saints. And in this way there were two cardinal principles. One of them was consecration, and the other stewardship.
So before we get too far into this, since he said this, there are two principles, consecration and stewardship. He's talking about the United Order. Now, I've made it clear that I believe, it is my personal belief that there is a difference between the law of consecration, which we are covenanted to follow in the temple, and the United Order, which we are not covenanted to follow in the temple. The difference being that consecration, the way I see it, the way I've gathered it to this point, and if I'm wrong, somebody please correct me, but the way I see it is that the United Order is done on the ward level, stake level, area level, or even the church level, where we're creating an order where we all kind of consecrate and contribute and help each other out. And basically we all become dependent upon each other, our own ecosystem or our own economy within the church. Whereas the law of consecration would be on a family or a personal level where we can consecrate our own things. Now, there's a difference between consecration and sacrifice, and I'll get to that in a future video because there's a wonderful quote by Elder Uchtdorf that I want to share with you later on, and that's not the point of this video. But I just wanted to point out the fact that I personally see a dividing line between the law of consecration and the United Order. And so when we start talking about the law of consecration, there are so many people, especially in our church, that will go, well, obviously in our church, that will immediately go put their mind into the United Order and think, oh, well, one day we're going to live this United Order. And the point of this whole thing is to say, hey, look, this is what consecration is not, and this is what consecration is. And there will come a time and a day when we can live the law of consecration, and we should be able to do that today because we've covenanted to do it today. And that's my whole argument. That's my whole point. That's the entire purpose of this video series. But just to keep in mind, United Order and consecration, there is a difference. That being that the United Order is dependent upon consecration, but consecration is not dependent upon the United Order. To move on now.
To enter the United Order, one consecrated all his possessions to the church. This he did by a deed, in the words of the Revelation, which cannot be broken. That is, you completely divested himself of all of his property by conveying it to the church. Having thus voluntarily divested himself of title to his property, the consecrator received from the church a stewardship by a like conveyance. This stewardship could be more or less than his original consecration. The object being to make every man equal according to his family and according to his circumstances and his wants and his needs.
Now I'm going to restate here again, just as I stated in video number 1 and video number 2, and also when I was talking about Brigham Young, which I think is video number 4, that the law of consecration and the United Order, this is not equal, dollar for dollar equal. This is equal according to his circumstances and his wants and his needs. Now, one of the best prime examples is when we're in the Doctrine and Covenants and these stewardships are being given out. Everyone consecrated their property in Kirtland, and then the stewardships are being given out. Newell K. Whitney consecrated his entire store. And what he gets back as his own private property is his store. He got his store back. So if it was a dollar for dollar equality like communists and socialists are pushing, then everyone would have their own store. Everyone would have a mercantile. And Oliver Cowdery, and I think it was William W. Phelps, got stewardship over the printing press. Had this been the United Order or even consecration been a dollar for dollar equality, then everyone would have gotten their own printing press. But it's very clear that that was not the case, because that's not the purpose and that's not the point of the United Order or the law of consecration. The purpose is to create an economy within a religious group that we can set up and sustain each other and ourselves without the needs of the outside world. Hopefully, I think eventually that would be the point, which is what Brigham Young had implied and talked about many times, is just this home manufacture idea. So anyway, moving on.
This procedure preserved in every man the right to private ownership and management of property. At his own option, he could alienate his property, he could keep it and operate it, and it could be passed on to his heirs. The intent, however, was for him to operate his property so as to produce a living for himself and his family and other dependents. So long as he remained in the order, he consecrated to the church the surplus he produced above the needs and wants of his family.
Okay, so this is, I think, very important. The surplus he produced above the needs of his wants and his family. And we still go out and produce a living, right? This is not communism. We don't go out and produce stuff to give to the state that then they turn around and dole out to everybody else. No. This is a surplus that is produced, and this is we produce a living, and then everything in our surplus above the needs and wants of his family goes to the United Order. So there is a quote, and I'll share this again in the future, but there's a quote by, and I'll give you the reference in the future. I'm not going to give it to you right now because I don't have it on the top of my head, but there's a quote by Harold B. Lee where he says that the United Order or the law of consecration is far more capitalistic than it is socialistic. And this is a prime example of what he's talking about, is that we still go out and we still produce in a capitalistic way. We still go out and work. Ooh, it disappeared on me there for a minute. I apologize. We work in a capitalistic way. Wrong one. We work in a capitalistic way, and we give our surplus into the order.
This surplus went into a storehouse from which stewardships were given to others and from which the needs of the poor were supplied.
Okay, another quick statement here. This storehouse, if you remember the video about J. Reuben Clark, and I've mentioned it in another video later on, but the video on J. Reuben Clark where he makes the statement that once the welfare system is set up, fully set up, that we will be meeting the intent of the law of consecration, or the United Order, as they were referring to it, that we are taking care of the needs of the poor. And so it's interesting to me to see that and to hear him say that, because I believe that God very sneakily, very quietly over time gave us commandments and said, okay, now go do this. Now go do this. Okay, good, now go do this. And so we failed at living the whole thing up front, which should be pretty obvious to everybody. But as God gave us a little bit more at a time, go pay an honest tithe. Hey, honest tithing, honest tithe. And so people would start paying their tithing. And then, hey, fast offerings, do a welfare program. And so as this slowly came into play, I believe that God was giving us the keys, or the foundation stones of the law of consecration, which eventually is a foundation stone of the United Order.
These divine principles are very simple and easily understood. A comparison of them with the underlying hallmarks of socialism reveals similarities and basic differences. Now, these are similarities. First, both socialism and the United Order deals with the production and the distribution of goods. Both aim to promote the well-being of men by eliminating their economic inequalities. Third, both envision the elimination of the selfish motives in our private capitalistic industrial system. Now, the differences. The cornerstone of the United Order is belief in God and acceptance of Him as Lord of the earth and the author of the United Order.
So this is one of the main points here, is that Marx and Engels really went through a lot of effort and energy to explain why the world works and why the universe works. Like, they came up with some crazy theories, to be straight with you, so that they could dismiss God completely. And the author of the Gulag Archipelago, I forget his name off the top of my head. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He once said, "Why has this happened to us?" And he spent years trying to study why this happened. And he was a Russian that got thrown into the gulags, which were the political prisons. And he said, and it comes down to the fact that we forgot God. We ignored God and we forgot God. This is why this happened to us. And so that's a main tenet of socialism and communism. And you're seeing that now. You're seeing it today. You can just turn on the news, or you can turn on whatever. You can see how many people are just offended by just the mere mention of religion or of God. And you can see it today.
Socialism is wholly materialistic. It's founded in the wisdom of men and not of God. Although all socialists may not be atheists, none of them in theory or practice seek the Lord to establish His righteousness. Second, the United Order is implemented by the voluntary free will actions of men. This is evidenced by the consecration of all their property to the Church of God. Socialism is implemented by external force, the force of the state. Third is to the ownership of property. As to property, in harmony with the church belief as set forth.
Okay, so there's a bit of a difference there in what he gave at BYU versus what he read or what's in the conference report for the General Conference. He basically cut out this whole paragraph. Now, one time the prophet Joseph Smith was asked a question by the brethren about the inventories they were taking. His answer was to the effect, you don't need to be concerned about the inventories unless a man is willing to consecrate everything he has. He doesn't come into the United Order. That's in the Church History of the Church, Volume 7. On the other hand, socialism is implemented by external force and the power of the state. And this is where he skipped to.
In the Doctrine and Covenants, that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience and the right and control of property. The United Order is operated upon the principle of private property and ownership and individual management. Socialism on the principle of collective or governmental ownership and management. Thus, in both implementation and ownership and management of property, the United Order preserves to men their God-given agency, while socialism deprives them of it. Fourth, the United Order is wholly non-political. Socialism is wholly political, both in theory and in practice. It is thus exposed to and riddled by the corruption which plagues and finally destroys all political governments which undertake to abridge men's agency. 5, a righteous people is a prerequisite to the United Order. Socialism argues that it, as a system, will eliminate the evils of the profit motive.
So, if you recall from the John Tyler video, where he's talking, John Taylor video, where he's talking to the socialist in France, and the socialist says, well, what are you going to do to ameliorate the human condition? And he just says, I'm going to keep baptizing people, because that ultimately is the answer. That is what helps us to eliminate the evils of the profit motive, is to help people remove the natural man.
The United Order exalts the poor and humbles the rich. In the process, both are sanctified. The poor, released from the bondage and humiliating limitations of poverty, are enabled as free men to rise to their full potential, both temporally and spiritually. The rich, by consecration and by imparting of their surplus for the benefit of the poor, not by constraint, but willingly, as an act of free will, evidence that charity for their fellow men characterized by Mormon as the pure love of Christ. No, students, socialism is not the United Order. Distinguishing between these two systems needs.
So he skipped another little section here, where he says, however, notwithstanding my abhorrence of it, I am persuaded that socialism is the wave of the present and of the foreseeable future. It has already taken over or is contending for control in most nations. I believe maybe he's just inserting something. You might hear him talk about this. I think he just either skipped this or he's inserting something in here, but let's take a listen.
It'd be no more difficult than solving the problem of the farmer who couldn't tell one of his horses from the other. They weighed the same, they pulled the same load, they ran at the same speed. From the looks of their teeth, they both were the same age. Finally, as a last resort, he measured them. And sure enough, the white horse was 6 hands higher than the black horse. Now, however, notwithstanding my abhorrence of it, I am persuaded that socialism is the wave of the present and of the foreseeable future in our world. It has already taken over, or is contending for control, in many, if not most, nations. At the end of 1965, socialist parties affiliated with the Socialist International were in control of the governments of Great Britain, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Israel, and the Malagasy Republic. They had representatives in coalition governments in Austria, Belgium, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. They constituted the chief opposition in France, India, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and West Germany, and were significant political forces in numerous other countries. Many parties dominant in Africa, Asia, and Latin America announced that their aim was a socialist society. We here in the United States, in converting our government into a social welfare state, have ourselves adopted much of socialism. Specifically, we have, to an alarming degree, adopted the use of the power of the state in the control and distribution of the fruits of industry. And we are on notice, according to the words of the President, that we are going much farther. For he is quoted as saying, "We are going to take all the money we think is unnecessarily being spent and take it from the haves and give it to the have-nots." That's the spirit of socialism. We're going to take. It isn't the spirit of we're going to give. We have also gone a long way on the road to public ownership and management of the vital means of production. In both of these areas, the free agency of Americans has been greatly abridged. Some argue that we have voluntarily surrendered this power to the government. Well, be this as it may, the fact remains that the loss of freedom with the consent of the enslaved, or even at their request, is nonetheless slavery.
So I'm going to stop here for just a moment because I was on an LDS chat dialogue room, and they were discussing democratic socialism, and this is my answer is directly from Marion G. Romney, that the loss of freedom with the consent of the enslaved, or even at their request, is still nonetheless slavery. So you can vote for slavery if you want to, and that's what we've started to do here in the United States, which is really unfortunate. But it still is slavery, and there's still issues with doing so. So anyway, carry on.
As to the fruits of socialism, we all have our own opinions. I myself have watched its growth in our own country and observed it in operation in many other lands. But I have yet to see a single instance, or hear of one, of its freeing from the hearts of men selfishness and greed, or of its bringing peace, or plenty, or freedom. These things it will never bring, nor will it do away with idleness and promote industry, thrift, and self-respect. For it is founded in theory and in practice on the principles of the evil one. Now, as to the fruits of industry, if we had time, as the fruits of united order, if we had time, we could review the history, what little we know about Zion in the days of Enoch, and about what happened under those principles in the first 2 centuries following the time of the Savior among the Nephites. I suggest that you read them. Well, now what can we do about it? As I recently reminded my wife of the moratorium on the United Order experiment and that socialism is taking over in the nations and that its express aims will surely fail, she spiritedly put to me the question, well then, what do you suggest? That we just sit on our hands and weep in despair and do nothing? Perhaps similar questions have occurred to you. The answer is no, by no means. We have much to do, and fortunately for us, we know that the Lord has definitely prescribed the course we should follow with respect to socialism and with respect to the United Order. He has told.
Now, in a previous video, I mentioned that J. Reuben Clark video, actually, I mentioned that every time, and I think again in another video, but every time that they talk about the United Order or socialism or communism, they always follow up with the Constitution. There's a reason for this, and Marion G. Romney is going to give us why that they do that.
That in preparation for the restoration of the gospel, he himself established the Constitution of the United States, and that there might be a government which, according to just and holy principles, would preserve to men their God-given agency. This he did because the whole gospel of Jesus Christ presupposes men's untrammeled right to exercise their free agency. Man is in this earth to be tested. The issue as to whether he succeeds or fails will be determined by how he uses his agency. His whole future, through all eternity, is at stake. Abridge man's agency and the whole purpose of his mortality is thwarted. Without it, the Lord says, there is no existence. He, that is the Lord, so valued man's agency that he himself designed and dictated the laws and constitution required to guarantee it. This he explained in a revelation in which he instructed the prophet Joseph Smith to appeal for help, and I quote, appeal for help according to the laws and constitution of the people, which I have suffered to be established and should be maintained, for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles, that every man may act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity, according to the moral agency which I have given unto him, that every man may be accountable unto me for his own sins in the day of judgment. And for this purpose, to preserve the rights of men's free agency, I established the constitution of this land by hands of wise men, whom I raised up unto this very purpose. Previously he had already said, and now verily I say unto you concerning the laws of this land, it is my will that my people should observe to do all things whatsoever I command them. And that law of the land which is constitutional. And then he gives the test for the constitutionality of the laws in his interpretation. That law of the land which is constitutional, supporting that principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before me. Therefore I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. And as pertaining to the law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. I, the Lord, make you free. Therefore ye are free indeed. And the law, that is the law that's constitutional in the eyes of God, also maketh you free.
So I just want to point out this verse here, because this verse is become obviously very important to me, and it's pertaining to the law of man. Whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. So when he's talking about the Constitution, he's talking about agency. There's a plethora of laws in the United States that trample over this agency and the Constitution. Just something I wanted to point out.
Nevertheless, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. Wherefore, honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men ye should observe to uphold. Otherwise, whatsoever is less than this cometh of evil. These scriptures reveal the fact that the Constitution is a divine document. They tell us that according to just and holy principles, the Constitution and the law of the land, which supports the principle of freedom in maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and is justifiable before God. That as pertaining to the law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. They remind us that the Lord has made us free, and that laws which are constitution will make us free also. And then right at this point, almost as if he were warning us against what's happening today, the Lord said, nevertheless, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. And then that we might know with certainty what we should be doing about it, he concluded, wherefore honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men ye should observe to uphold. In its context, this construction can only mean that we should seek diligently for and support men to represent us in government who are wise enough to understand freedom as provided by the Constitution and as implemented in the United Order, and who are honest enough and good enough to fight for the preservation of that freedom.
So I really don't want my YouTube channel to get super political, but I will say that whether Democrat or Republican, I can only think of a handful of people who are representing the people in the government, either in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, who actually do support and defend the Constitution. There's very few. Most of them are compromised in some way, where they're willing to give up rights in one place or another, and that it's really unfortunate. And that's they're not the wise men that God has encouraged us to find and to seek out. Personal opinion, obviously.
Under no other government could the church have been established, said President Clark, and he continued, if we are to live as a church and progress and have the right to worship as we're worshiping here today, we must have the great guarantees that are set up in our Constitution. There is no other way in which we can secure these guarantees.
That's also the same talk where he talked about communism in the United Order, October 1942, for anyone looking for the reference.
Well now, not forgetting our duty to eschew socialism and support the just and holy principles of the Constitution as directed by the Lord, I shall conclude these remarks with a few comments concerning what we should do about the United Order. The final words of the Lord in suspending the United Order experiments were these: and let those commandments which I have given concerning Zion and her law be executed and fulfilled after her redemption. Thus, further implementation of the order must await the redemption of Zion. And here Zion means Jackson County, Missouri. And when Zion is redeemed, as it most certainly shall be, it will be redeemed under a government and by a people strictly observing those just and holy principles of the Constitution which accord to men their God-given moral agency, including the right to private property. If in the meantime socialism takes over in America, it will have to be displaced, if need be, by the power of God, because the United Order can never function under socialism or a welfare state, for the good and sufficient reason that the principles upon which socialism and the United Order are conceived and operated are inimical.
So I want to make this clear. This PDF file is just horrible. Socialism has to be displaced if we want to live the United Order, simply because socialism requires giving. It requires the government to take, which they love. And it then is a willing and wanting and charitable heart that gives. And so these operate in an inimical manner. They do not operate in a way which they can be operated together. You can live the United Order in a capitalist society, but you cannot live the United Order in a socialist society.
In the meantime, while we await the redemption of Zion and the establishment of the United Order, we as Latter-day Saints should live strictly by the principles of the United Order, insofar as they are embodied in present church practices, such as the fast offering, tithing, and the welfare activities. Through these practices, we could, as individuals, if we were of a mind to, implement in our own lives all the basic principles of the United Order. Now let me give it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's kind of where I'm getting to with this whole thing, which is one of the main reasons I wanted to share this talk, was that that if we do all these things, we could individuals, as an individual or as a family, implement the law of consecration, which is what I say is on an individual or family level. That's how I differentiate the United Order versus the law of consecration, is that we're doing it in our own lives. So we're living the basic principles of the United Order. 100% I agree with that, and that's exactly where this is all going. I know that in the beginning I was very careful about not trying to interject my opinion, but at this point it should be clear. There are a few things which I will add on to this consecration concept and the United Order concept that I think are just as important, if not as important. I would say even, more important than the temporal aspect of the United Order. That I will get to in a future video.
Some examples of that. When the law of tithing, you remember that the principles underlying the United Order are consecration and stewardships, and then the contribution of surpluses into the bishop's storehouse. Now, when the law of tithing was instituted, 4 years after the United Order experiment was suspended, the Lord required the people to put all their surplus property into the hands of the bishop. That was at the start of tithing. And thereafter, they were to pay not their surpluses, but 1/10 of their interest annually as tithing. This law is still in force, as you may have heard about. And it implements to a degree the United Order principle of stewardship, for it leaves in the hands of the individual the ownership and the management of the property from which he produces the needs of himself and family. And furthermore, to use again the words of President Clark, in lieu of the residues and the surpluses which were accumulated and built up under the United Order, we today have our fast offerings, our welfare donations, and our tithing. These we pay into the church of our own free will in place of the surplus. We're not ready yet to ever have a surplus if we leave it to ourselves to judge. So the Lord lays down specifically a tenth, a fast offering, and welfare contributions. All of these may be devoted to the care of the poor, as well as for the carrying on of the activities and the business of the church. Furthermore, we had under the United Order a bishop's storehouse in which were collected.
So it appears I guess he talked about this. Oh man, this PDF file is terrible. It wants to underline everything. He talked about this kind of in the middle of his last paragraph, but it's more succinctly said and more clearly said right here in the PDF file. So what prohibits us from giving as much in fast offerings as we would have given in surpluses under the United Order? Nothing but our own limitations. Something just I wanted to point out there.
Were collected materials from which to supply the needs and wants of the poor. We have a bishop's storehouse today under the welfare program used for the same purpose. We have now under the welfare plan all over the church land projects formed for the benefit of the poor. Thus, in many of its great essentials, we have in the welfare plan the broad essentials of the United Order. Furthermore, having in mind the assistance which is being given from time to time to help set people up in business or in farming, we have a plan which is not essentially unlike that which was in the United Order when the poor were given portions from the common fund. It is thus apparent that when the principles of tithing and the fast are properly observed and the welfare plan gets fully developed and wholly into operation, we shall not be so very far from carrying out the great fundamentals of the United Order. The only limitation on you and me is within ourselves. And now, in line with these remarks, for three things I pray. First, that the Lord will somehow quicken our understanding of the differences between socialism and the United Order and give us a vivid awareness of the awful portent of those differences. Second, that we will hear it at this university, develop the understanding and the desire and the courage born of the Spirit to eschew socialism and support and sustain in the manner revealed and as interpreted by the Lord those just and holy principles embodied in the Constitution of the United States for the protection of all flesh in the exercise of their God-given agency. And third, that through faithful observance of the principles of tithing, fast, and the welfare program, we will prepare ourselves to redeem Zion and ultimately live the United Order. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Well, that's it. That's the talk given by Marion G. Romney in General Conference, 1966. He also gave it at BYU. Both links will be in the description, as always. This video has already gone on too long, so just going to end with just a simple thing, a simple testimony, simple statement that I believe that Elder Romney was absolutely correct in that the only thing that limits us from living the law of consecration fully or living the United Order is ourselves, and that we are already very close to it. The church is probably, I would say the church is already living the law of consecration. And, and if you look back at history and you realize what God did is he said, oh, fine. Don't live the United Order anymore. You're released from the United Order, but you should pay tithing. You should do a welfare program. You should do this. Oh, you should do that. And so before long, here we are. Very, very close to what I would call the United Order. And I'll get into the specifics and details in a future video, and not to drag this out too long. But I know that this can work, and I know from experience that I've had so far that God answers prayers. And I will leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.